Victoria Ashworth adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist as she surveyed the opulent living room of her Beacon Hill mansion. At 48, she had built a real estate empire worth $200 million through a combination of ruthless negotiation, strategic partnerships, and an uncanny ability to exploit legal loopholes. Her Boston estate reflected her success: marble floors imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers from Austria, and artwork that cost more than most people's homes. Carmen Rodriguez had been cleaning Victoria's house for 4 years, arriving every Tuesday and Friday at 7 in the morning to maintain the pristine perfection that Victoria demanded. At 55, Carmen moved through the mansion with quiet efficiency, her weathered hands polishing surfaces that already gleamed, her presence so routine that Victoria barely acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional critical comment about a missed spot or a displaced object. This particular Tuesday morning was different. Victoria sat at her mahogany dining table, surrounded by legal documents that represented her latest acquisition, a historic waterfront property that would be converted into luxury condominiums. The deal had taken 18 months to negotiate, involving complex zoning issues, historical preservation requirements, and intricate financing arrangements. Carmen entered the dining room carrying her supplies, automatically beginning to dust the sideboard while Victoria reviewed the contracts with her reading glasses perched on her nose. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated hundreds of pages of legal text, each paragraph dense with terminology that had taken Victoria's team of lawyers weeks to craft. "These idiots at Patterson & Associates think they're so clever," Victoria muttered to herself, flipping through a particularly complex section dealing with environmental liability. 20 years of legal experience, and they still can't write a contract that protects all the angles. Carmen continued her work silently, accustomed to Victoria's habit of talking to herself while reviewing business documents. She had learned over the years that her employer preferred to be ignored during these moments, treated as if she were alone with her thoughts. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her concentration. The caller ID showed her business partner, Robert Manning, and she answered with barely concealed irritation. The address listed was 1247 Commercial Street, and suddenly, the memory that had been nagging at her crystallized with startling clarity. Victoria noticed Carmen's expression had changed, a look of recognition replacing her usual neutral demeanor. "What are you staring at?" "Nothing, ma'am. Just organizing my cleaning supplies." But Victoria had spent decades reading people, negotiating deals based on subtle shifts in expression and body language. Carmen's face showed something more than casual interest, and Victoria's predatory instincts were immediately alert. "You were looking at my contracts," Victoria said slowly, studying Carmen's reaction. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to intrude." Victoria's eyes narrowed. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate the natural order of things, to remind this cleaning woman of her place while amusing herself during a stressful morning. "Do you know what these contracts are about, Carmen?" "No, ma'am." "They're about a $200 million real estate development. The most complex legal and financial arrangement you could possibly imagine." Victoria's voice carried a condescending tone that made Carmen's skin crawl. "Contracts that took teams of Harvard-educated lawyers months to negotiate." Carmen remained silent, sensing danger in Victoria's shift of mood. "I bet you've never seen anything like this before," Victoria continued, picking up the thickest document from the pile. Hundreds of pages of legal terminology, environmental regulations, zoning requirements, financial structures. The kind of document that would be completely meaningless to someone like you. The insult hung in the air between them, but Carmen had endured worse over the years. She had learned to absorb such comments without reaction, to remain invisible rather than risk her job by defending her dignity. Victoria stood and walked around the table, holding the contract like a weapon. "In fact, I'll make you a bet, Carmen, a simple little wager between us." Carmen felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "I bet you can't even read the first page of this contract and understand what it means. Hell, I bet you can't even translate half the legal terms into plain English." Victoria's smile was cruel, predatory. "And if you can't, if you fail to demonstrate even basic comprehension of what this document says, then you're fired. Immediately." Quote, Carmen stared at this woman who had just threatened her livelihood for sport, who was willing to destroy someone's financial security to prove a point about social hierarchy. 4 years of steady employment, health insurance, the income that helped support her disabled sister, all of it hanging in the balance because Victoria Ashworth needed to feel superior. "But if by some miracle you can translate this contract," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false generosity, "if you can demonstrate that a cleaning lady somehow possesses the legal knowledge to understand complex real estate law, then I'll give you a bonus. Let's say $1,000 for your trouble." Carmen looked at the contract in Victoria's hands, then at the woman who held her economic survival hostage to her own ego. For 4 years she had endured condescension, casual insults, and the daily reminder that Victoria saw her as barely human. She had accepted it all because she needed the job, because fighting back seemed impossible, because she had convinced herself that keeping quiet was the same as keeping safe. But something in Victoria's expression, the absolute certainty that Carmen would fail and could be discarded without consequence, ignited a spark of defiance that had been dormant for years. "What exactly do you want me to translate?" Carmen asked quietly. Victoria's smile widened. "The first section. Environmental liability and historical preservation requirements. Explain to me, in simple terms that someone of your education level could understand, what those legal terms mean and how they apply to this project." Carmen reached for the contract, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. Victoria handed it over with the confidence of someone who was about to watch a mouse try to roar. Carmen opened to the first page and began reading silently, her eyes moving across the dense legal text with a familiarity that would have surprised Victoria if she had been paying attention. But Victoria was already savoring her victory, already planning the dismissive speech she would give when Carmen inevitably failed. After several minutes, Carmen looked up from the document. "Are you sure you want me to translate this?" "Absolutely. I'm curious to see how badly you embarrass yourself." Carmen took a deep breath, understanding that the next few minutes would either destroy her life or transform it entirely. "The environmental liability section states that the purchaser, which is your company, assumes full responsibility for any contamination discovered on the property, including contamination that predates your ownership." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. That was actually correct. The section goes on to specify that if contamination is discovered that requires EPA remediation, the purchaser is liable for all cleanup costs, potential fines, and any third-party damage claims. There is no cap on this liability, and it cannot be transferred to insurance carriers for incidents that occurred before 1975. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. Carmen wasn't just reading, she was understanding. And more troubling, she was identifying the exact clauses that Victoria's lawyers had been concerned about. "The historical preservation requirements," Carmen continued, "specify that any structure built before 1945 on the property must be evaluated by a certified historical preservation specialist before demolition permits can be issued. If the structure is found to have historical significance, the purchaser must either incorporate it into the new development or pay for its relocation to a suitable site." "That's..." Victoria struggled to find words. "That's essentially correct, but..." "But there's more," Carmen said calmly. Section 12.3 contains language that most people would miss. It states that the seller has provided, quote, "all known documentation regarding previous use of the property." The word known is crucial because it means if documentation exists that the seller was unaware of, the purchaser still bears full responsibility for any issues that arise from that documentation. Victoria sank slowly into her chair. Carmen wasn't just reading the contract. She was analyzing it with the precision of an experienced attorney. "Where did you learn to read legal documents?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carmen set the contract down gently on the table. "I was a paralegal for 15 years before I started cleaning houses. I worked for Morrison, Clark & Associates, specializing in real estate law and environmental litigation." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Morrison, Clark & Associates was one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston, known for handling complex commercial real estate transactions and environmental law cases. "That's impossible," Victoria said weakly. "I lost my job during the 2008 financial crisis when the firm downsized. At 51, with an economic recession destroying the legal job market, I couldn't find another paralegal position. Firms were hiring recent graduates for half the salary I needed to support my family." Carmen's voice was steady, professional. "Cleaning houses paid the bills while I cared for my disabled sister and helped my daughter through college." Victoria stared at this woman she had dismissed, belittled, and threatened for 4 years, slowly realizing the magnitude of her miscalculation. "You want to know about the Harborview property?" Carmen continued. "I worked on the environmental assessment for that site in 2005. The warehouse at 1247 Commercial Street was used by Sterling Chemical Company during World War II to manufacture industrial solvents for the war effort. When Sterling went bankrupt in 1947, they abandoned the property without proper environmental cleanup." Victoria felt the room spinning around her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I spent 3 months researching that property's history for a client who was considering purchasing it. Morrison, Clark and Associates represented the potential buyer, and I was the paralegal assigned to the environmental due diligence. We discovered extensive soil contamination, groundwater pollution, and the presence of several chemicals that were later classified as carcinogens." Carmen reached into her cleaning supplies and pulled out a worn folder that Victoria had never noticed before. "I've been carrying this for 13 years, along with documentation on dozens of other properties I researched. Old habits die hard." She opened the folder and removed several photocopied documents. "These are copies of the original Sterling Chemical Company records, filed with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection in 1946. They show exactly which chemicals were used, where they were stored, and how they were disposed of when the company closed." Victoria's hands shook as she examined the documents. The chemical names matched exactly with the contaminants that had just been discovered by the EPA, and the disposal methods described were primitive by modern standards, virtually guaranteeing long-term environmental contamination. "This documentation would have saved you millions of dollars in due diligence costs," Carmen said quietly, "if you had bothered to ask your cleaning lady if she knew anything about the property you were buying." The implications crashed over Victoria like a tsunami. Not only had she unknowingly employed someone with expert knowledge of the very property she was purchasing, but she had just threatened to fire that person for being unable to understand legal documents that Carmen probably understood better than Victoria herself. "The historical preservation issue is even worse for your project," Carmen continued relentlessly. "That warehouse isn't just any old building. It was the primary manufacturing site for a chemical compound that was crucial to the Allied war effort. The building is almost certainly eligible for National Historic Register status, which would make demolition nearly impossible." Victoria buried her face in her hands. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "When would I have told you?" Carmen asked. "In 4 years of working here, you've spoken to me exactly 37 times, and 34 of those conversations were criticism of my cleaning. You've never asked about my background, my experience, or whether I might have knowledge that could help you. But you knew I was making a massive mistake." Carmen's expression softened slightly. "I knew you were buying a contaminated property with historical complications. I didn't know it was going to cost you everything." Victoria looked up sharply. "What do you mean, everything?" "Mrs. Ashworth, the environmental liability clause in your contract makes you personally responsible for cleanup costs that could easily exceed $50 million. The historical preservation requirements will prevent you from demolishing the existing structure, which means your entire development plan is worthless. And the EPA investigation will trigger a review of all your other properties for similar issues." The full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Victoria's company had leveraged everything on this project, using her other properties as collateral for the massive loans required to purchase the Harborview site. If the project failed, she wouldn't just lose money, she would lose everything. "There has to be a way out," Victoria said desperately. "Legal remedies, insurance claims, something." Carmen shook her head sadly. "I've seen this exact scenario play out before. The contract language is ironclad, and your lawyers either missed the implications or assumed you understood the risks you were taking." Victoria sat in stunned silence, contemplating the ruins of her empire. 2 hours ago, she had been worth $200 million. Now she was facing personal bankruptcy, legal liability that could follow her for decades, and the destruction of everything she had built. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice broken. Carmen looked at this woman who had spent years treating her as invisible, who had just threatened her livelihood for sport, who was now asking for help from the person she had tried to humiliate. The request should have felt like justice, but instead, Carmen felt only sadness for the waste of it all. You need to contact your lawyers immediately and explore options for withdrawing from the contract. You'll lose your deposit and probably face penalty clauses, but that's better than proceeding with a project that will bankrupt you. Will they let me withdraw? Possibly. The discovery of undisclosed environmental contamination might give you grounds to claim misrepresentation by the seller. It's a long shot, but it's your only shot. Victoria nodded numbly, reaching for her phone to call her legal team. But before she could dial, she looked up at Carmen with an expression that was part desperation and part dawning respect. Will you help me? I know I have no right to ask, but you understand this situation better than anyone. Carmen studied Victoria's face, seeing for the first time not arrogance or superiority, but genuine human vulnerability. This was a woman facing the loss of everything she had worked for, brought down by her own assumptions and prejudices. I'll help, Carmen said quietly. But not as your cleaning lady, as the legal expert I've always been. Victoria nodded, finally understanding the magnitude of her blindness. What do you want? Money, a position with my company, whatever you need. I want you to understand something, Carmen said, gathering up the contracts and organizing them with professional efficiency. For 4 years, you've had one of the most experienced real estate paralegals in Boston, cleaning your toilets and vacuuming your carpets. I have knowledge and skills that could have saved you millions, prevented disasters, identified opportunities you never would have seen. Carmen stood and looked down at Victoria, who remained seated at the table like a broken doll. But you never asked. You never wondered if the person washing your floors might have something valuable to offer beyond cleaning services. You assumed that because I was doing menial work, I was only capable of menial work. The truth of it hit Victoria like a physical blow. How many other opportunities had she missed? How many other people had she dismissed based on their job titles rather than their capabilities? The millionaire bet was that I couldn't translate your contract, Carmen said, walking toward the door. But the real translation you needed was this. Everyone you meet knows something you don't. Everyone has value beyond what you can see on the surface. And the most expensive mistake you can make is assuming that someone's current circumstances define their complete worth. Carmen paused at the doorway and looked back one final time. I'll help you try to save what can be saved of your business, Mrs. Ashworth. But I'll be doing it as Carmen Rodriguez, J.D. from Suffolk Law School, 15-year veteran of commercial real estate law, and expert in environmental litigation. Not as your maid. As Carmen left the mansion, Victoria sat alone among the contracts that represented the ruins of her empire, finally understanding that the person she had just destroyed wasn't Carmen. It was herself. The cleaning lady's response hadn't just translated a legal document, it had exposed the fundamental ignorance that had always been Victoria's greatest weakness, the inability to see the value in people who didn't look like her version of success. The millionaire had made her bet and lost everything, defeated not by superior force or clever tactics, but by her own arrogance and the quiet competence of someone she had never bothered to truly see. As Carmen left the mansion, Victoria sat alone among the contracts that represented the ruins of her empire, finally understanding that the person she had just destroyed wasn't Carmen. It was herself. The cleaning lady's response hadn't just translated a legal document. It had exposed the fundamental ignorance that had always been Victoria's greatest weakness, the inability to see the value in people who didn't look like her version of success. The millionaire had made her bet and lost everything, defeated not by superior force or clever tactics, but by her own arrogance and the quiet competence of someone she had never bothered to truly see. But Carmen hadn't left the mansion. She had walked to the kitchen and was now returning with a cup of coffee and another folder, this one much thicker than the first. Victoria looked up through her tears as Carmen sat down across from her at the dining table. There's something else you need to know, Carmen said calmly, opening the new folder. Something I didn't mention about Sterling Chemical Company. Victoria wiped her eyes, wondering what other disasters awaited her. More contamination? Not exactly. Carmen pulled out a yellowed photograph showing a young woman in 1940s clothing standing in front of the warehouse. This is my grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez. She worked at Sterling Chemical during the war. Victoria stared at the photograph, confused about why Carmen was sharing family history at this moment. My grandmother wasn't just an employee, Carmen continued. She was the plant supervisor's secretary, and she was having an affair with the company owner, James Sterling. I don't understand what this has to do with... Carmen pulled out another document, this one a legal deed. When Sterling abandoned the property in 1947, he didn't actually abandon it. He deeded it to my grandmother as settlement for their illegitimate child, my father. Victoria's hands trembled as she examined the deed. The property at 1247 Commercial Street had been legally transferred to Rosa Rodriguez in 1947, but the deed had never been recorded with the city. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. We did a complete title search. The property has been owned by the city since 1948. The city took possession for unpaid taxes because no one knew about the private transfer. But the original deed supersedes the tax seizure. Carmen's voice was steady, professional. I've spent 15 years researching this, waiting for the right moment. Victoria felt reality shifting around her. I mean that you just purchased contaminated property from the city, but the city never actually owned it. The real owner is my family. Your entire contract is void because the seller had no legal right to sell. The implications hit Victoria like a sledgehammer. Not only was her development project doomed, but she had no legal recourse because she had unknowingly purchased stolen property. But why didn't you say something before? Why let me make this purchase? Carmen smiled for the first time in 4 years of working for Victoria. Because I needed you to commit fully to the purchase before I revealed the true ownership. If I had told you earlier, you would have found a way to steal the property from my family, just like you've stolen from everyone else your entire career. Victoria stared at this woman she had dismissed as insignificant. You planned this, all of it. I spent 3 years getting hired as your cleaning lady. 3 years listening to your business calls, learning about your methods, waiting for you to target the one property that would destroy you. I knew your personality, your arrogance. I knew that eventually you would try to humiliate someone you considered beneath you, and that would be the perfect moment to reveal who I really am. Carmen reached into the folder one final time and withdrew a business card. Carmen Rodriguez, Esquire, Environmental Law Specialist, Rodriguez and Associates. You're an attorney? Victoria's voice was barely audible. Harvard Law School, class of 1995. I've been practicing environmental law for 25 years, specializing in cases where corporations have illegally profited from contaminated properties. Carmen's professional mask had completely replaced her submissive cleaning lady persona. I spent the last 4 years building an ironclad case against everyone involved in the illegal sale of my family's property. Victoria felt her world collapse completely. What do you want? Justice. The property is worth approximately $50 million once properly remediated. Your company will pay those remediation costs as compensation for the contamination you helped conceal. The city will face federal charges for selling property they didn't own, and every developer who participated in this fraud will face both criminal and civil liability. Carmen stood and gathered her folders. The Environmental Protection Agency has been working with me for 2 years. They'll be serving warrants tomorrow morning. The FBI will be investigating the falsified environmental reports that allowed this sale to proceed. This will destroy me, Victoria said numbly. Yes, it will, just like you destroyed my family when you bought our property through fraudulent means. Just like you've destroyed countless families with your predatory business practices. Carmen's voice carried no malice, only the calm satisfaction of justice finally served. But I didn't know. I had no idea the property belonged to your family. Carmen paused at the doorway. Mrs. Ashworth, in 4 years of working here, did you ever once ask me about my family, my background, my education, my dreams? Victoria couldn't answer. If you had bothered to learn anything about the woman cleaning your house, you would have discovered that I am the great-granddaughter of Sterling Chemical Company's true owner, a Harvard-educated environmental attorney who has spent decades fighting corporate polluters, and someone who knew more about the property you wanted to buy than your entire legal team combined. Carmen smiled one final time. The Millionaire's bet was that I couldn't translate your contract, but the translation you really needed was this. The person you underestimate the most might just be the one with the power to destroy everything you think you own. As Carmen walked out of the mansion for the last time, Victoria sat surrounded by worthless contracts, finally understanding that she had been checkmate from the moment she hired the cleaning lady who was actually the rightful owner of the property that would end her career. The maid hadn't just responded to Victoria's challenge. She had been orchestrating Victoria's downfall for 4 years, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to reveal that the most powerful person in the room had been cleaning the toilets all along.